Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today we're continuing the 2018 year-end list with my top 10 favorite songs of 2018. Now 2018 overall was a pretty great year for music. There was tons of great albums and especially tons of great songs that were released this year. So today I've narrowed down a lot of my favorites from this year to just be 10 tracks to share with you guys today, my 10 favorite songs if you will. Now I do want to make it clear that this list is just my own personal opinion, as in all these songs are just picked from the selection of songs I happen to hear from this year, and they're just the ones that I happen to enjoy the most. I'm not trying to say that these are the 10 objective best songs or anything like that. These are just my 10 favorites from the year, pretty much. Also, there is a one song per album rule present here on today's list. That's just to make sure that every pick here is somewhat different from each other, just to make this video a bit more interesting and to give you guys some more varied picks here to possibly search out and listen to later on. And in order to make your search for great 2018 music a bit easier, I've made two playlists in Spotify linked in the description down below. The first of those is literally just this video and the picks I have here. The second of those two is a more general playlist that doesn't adhere to the one song per artist rule, and also contains songs by artists that don't even appear on this list I'm about to talk about today, because I did have to make some pretty difficult cuts here just to narrow it down to 10. Overall, consider that playlist like the honorable mentions, and there is a lot of songs in that playlist. It's over 100 tracks overall, so there's plenty of music to sink your teeth into there if you're curious for more great picks from 2018. But yeah, with all of that out of the way, I think it's time to get into this list with my number 10 pick. At this spot on the list, I have Mr. Tillman by Father John Misty from his newest album, God's Favorite Customer. And this was an album that overall felt a bit more personal and a bit more upfront than Father John Misty's previous efforts, whereas those had a lot of sarcasm in them. This album certainly still does have it in some regards, but it was a bit more personal at the same time. It was just a bit more honest at times, I feel like, with its emotions as well. However, Mr. Tillman is one of the more cheeky tracks on the album, I'd say. This track deals with Father John Misty attempting to pretty much live in this hotel, and much of the track's perspective is actually told from some of the staff in the hotel itself, it seems, as they're kind of, in a way, critiquing his activity and his behavior while at the hotel, kind of pointing out that it's not quite as sane as he seems to think it is, as he tries to justify on the chorus when he sings that he's feeling fine. And what I really like about the lyrics here on this track is that it allows Father John Misty to be both critical and sarcastic and keep that persona that he's built up in his previous works, while also being really upfront and critical about himself at the same time. Overall, it makes for a pretty interesting listen. The instrumentation here on this track is also pretty great as well. It keeps this very upbeat and happy feel that at times reflects the kind of upbeat feel that is trying to be sold here in the lyrics, even though under the surface there's a bit more critical things being said at the end of the day. Overall, it's a great track, a pretty catchy song too, and definitely one that you should check out if you haven't done so. Great track. Next up on the list, I have 1539 North Calvert by JPEG Mafia. This comes off his newest album, Veteran, and it's the opening track on the album. And overall, it's a pretty great opening track, one of the best opening tracks I've heard this year, and just a fantastic song in general. The track starts with this longer, more drawn-out instrumental opening. It's definitely something a bit unconventional, but that's something that you would expect from JPEG Mafia, given his really eclectic and odd style of production and just making music in general. And when JPEG Mafia decides to start rapping on this track itself, he does an excellent job here. I love his flows, I love his lyrics on this thing. I like how they're both very aggressive but kind of playful at the same time. They're very JPEG Mafia in nature. If you're familiar with his music, you kind of know what I mean by that, in the regard that they could feel really over the top, but at the same time very down to earth in a sense. And some of the lyrics and references he makes on this track are just pretty interesting or funny overall. I particularly like the reference to Mike Seatown of Dead End Hip Hop on this thing. I just thought it was a pretty cool reference and shout out here. Overall, just a fantastic track. Like I said, one of my favorite album openers of the year. Definitely one you need to listen to if you're a hip hop fan. Next up, we have Faith by Ghost here. This comes off their newest album, Prequel, that came out earlier in 2018. And overall, this is just a stellar Ghost track from start to finish. I love how this track has that explosive and grand feel to it that I love hearing from Ghost, with a hook that's just a massive, larger than life in a sense, but is also insanely catchy and gets stuck in your head super easily. The instrumentation on this track also helps play with that catchy, accessible, yet at the same time very grand sounding feel that this track has going for it. The solo on this track is also pretty excellent as well. Overall, it's just an A-tier ghost track at the end of the day. Does everything I really love hearing from this group and doesn't mess up anywhere along the way. Definitely check this out if you're a metal fan. Next up on the list, I have 10 to You by Fully Involved. This track overall kind of sounds like Green Album era Weezer, but if it had the overall kind of sound and production of maybe like Pinkerton era Weezer, in the regard that it's a very catchy, really straightforward, very fun, kind of alternative rock, pop rock song, but it has this more rough around the edges feel to it that I really like. Unlike a lot of more modern alternative rock that can feel really overproduced at times, this track, I just love the more do-it-yourself aesthetic that this thing has going for it. I love the really crunchy sounding guitar riffs on this thing. And I also love a lot of the passion you can clearly hear coming through on a track like this. And while this track certainly has a very do-it-yourself, almost punk-like aesthetic and feel to it, it also is just, at the end of the day, a very well-constructed song. And despite the fact that it does have all those qualities to it, it also has a very catchy, memorable chorus to it as well. One that's just an instant earworm, really. One of the best I've heard this year. So if you're looking for some great alternative, garagey, pop-punk sounding rock music, this is definitely a track you should have on your radar. And Fully Involved is probably one of the smaller artists on this list here today, and is still an artist that is definitely worth your time, that you should definitely be paying attention to. So yeah, check this track out. Next up on the list, we have the track Over Again by Mike Shinoda. This track originally appeared on the Post-Traumatic EP that he dropped back in January of 2018, but was later also included on the Post-Traumatic album that he released later in the year. This track, like many of these songs from the two projects that this track was also a part of, is about Mike's loss of Chester Bennington, who is Mike's bandmate in Linkin Park. And as you might anticipate, this song deals with some pretty heavy stuff as a result of that. On this track, Mike gives us a nice look into his own personal life following Chester's death, including preparing for the concert they did in honor of Chester, as well as just talking about his own thoughts and his own mental state following all this. It's all some pretty heavy stuff, and as a pretty big Linkin Park fan myself, while I can't necessarily relate to the same extent that Mike is, considering, of course, he knew Chester personally, they were bandmates, they were friends, and someone like me, of course, was just a fan, but still, me, as well as, I'm guessing, many Linkin Park fans out there, could probably relate in some way, at least, on some level with the stuff Mike is talking about here on the song. Outside of the subject matter of this track, Mike's delivery here is also pretty well done. It's nothing super complex or crazy or anything quite like that, but I feel like the more straightforward approach that he takes here works, given that the lyrics are really the focal point of the song, if you will, and I could say the same thing for the production as well. It's nicely done, but at the same time, it's not overdone to the point where it's distracting from the lyrics here on this track, which are clearly intended to be the biggest and most eye-catching, or ear-catching, I guess, aspect of this track. Overall, definitely one of the more personal and emotional tracks that I've heard this year. Definitely one that can be difficult to revisit at times given the events that it talks about, but definitely still a track that I'm very happy exists, and I'm definitely happy that Mike was able to get across dealing with all of this, get across his emotions and all of that through tracks like this, as well as many of the others from his recent output. But overall, if there was one track I had to pick from that recent output that was my favorite, it would be this one. I feel like this one best embodies a lot of it just in one single track. So if you're a Linkin Park fan, if you were affected in any way by Chester's death back when that happened, this is definitely a track that I feel like you'll be able to relate to in some regard. Yeah, overall, great song. Moving on, the next pick on my list is Death Grips is Online by Death Grips from their newest album, Year of the Snitch. Like many Death Grips songs, this one is pretty odd and strange in many regards. I mean, the title of this track is pretty much based on a meme that the band themselves started, so that right there will probably let you know that this song isn't necessarily going to be the most typical. I really love the synths that come in on this track right from the get-go. They're very catchy, they really stand out as well, and every time they pop up in on this track, I just find them really interesting, I guess. I also really like how during the verses of this track, MC Ride's a bit more reserved overall. He's not really yelling or screaming or anything like that. He's just kind of rapping in a more standard format, if you will. However, during the hook of this track, he's able to just unleash a lot of that anger and aggression, and there's a nice dynamic between the verses and the hooks here on this track, pretty much. So overall, this is just a pretty interesting Death Grips track at the end of the day, and I'm sure, like I said before, interesting is a thing that you could use to describe pretty much everything Death Grips has done so far, but this one, at least from this newest album and newest batch of songs they've given us, is definitely one of the standouts. Next up on the list, I have Honeycomb by Death Haven. This track comes off their newest album, Ordinary Corrupt Human Love, and overall is a pretty interesting and detailed track. Despite this track's length at over 10 minutes long, there's a lot going on here in this song. There's not a dull moment on this thing, and they're always able to keep my attention as I'm listening to this thing. Whether it be with some of the more aggressive black metal elements on this track, including some of the more aggressive moments of instrumentation, and of course, those otherworldly shrieked vocals that are just present throughout this thing. But there's also moments on this thing where the instrumentation decides to become just a lot more beautiful overall. And how this track is able to switch things up between the more aggressive and the more calming and beautiful sounding, at times even trying to pull off both at the same time, is really what makes a track like this stand out at the end of the day. And the same could be said for a lot of Death Haven's music, especially on this last album of theirs. However, I feel like this track is the one that really pulls it off the best. So overall, music fans, definitely don't miss out on this one. Don't let the longer length scare you off or anything. It's worth every minute or every second you're going to spend listening to this thing. Give it a listen for sure. Moving into the top 3 now, we have Danny Don't You Know by Ninja Sex Party at number 3. And you might be thinking to yourself, a comedy song at number 3 on a Best Albums of the Year list? That's kinda odd. And yeah, as I mentioned in my Worst Songs of the Year list, I do like a fair bit of comedy music, and some comedy music was going to be ending up pretty highly on my Best Songs and Best Albums list. And that's what we're talking about right now, pretty much. Now, I've heard many people say that Danny Don't You Know is probably one of Ninja Sex Party's least funny songs overall, and to that, I would agree. However, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, given a lot of the other aspects of this track that really get the shine here. One of the aspects I really love about this track is that it's able to maintain that comedy side of the group while also being pretty sincere at the same time. This song deals with the lead singer of the band, Danny, talking to his younger self and pretty much telling him that despite the fact that he's kind of not exactly a super popular or successful person at the time that he's talking to himself, he will one day get to be that rock star that he desires to be. It's a pretty inspirational track at the end of the day, especially given the band's humble beginnings and how they were pretty much able to become one of the bigger comedy groups out there, just on their own pretty much. And while the lyrics and overall subject matter of the track are great, it's also the presentation of the track and the instrumentation that goes along with it that really helps sells it at the end of the day. This track is pretty much your typical sort of power ballad that starts off slower, more introspective, but eventually builds up into this massive arena rock type track that just has a massive hook, instantly catchy chorus to it, and it's just the type of track that you really just want to sing along to because it's so much fun and it's so catchy, and also because it's really inspiring as well. Frequent collaborators Tupperware Remix Party pop on this track to do some additional backing instrumentation, and they do a great job here. I've always said that these two groups mesh together fantastically, and this track just proves why. They do some great backing instrumentation here. They bring that very 80s sound that they have going for them, and this track at the end of the day does really feel like a massive 80s power ballad, and they really help sell it here. I also really love the very flashy 80s feeling guitar solo that pops up on this track as well. Just an excellent, cool sounding solo at the end of the day. So yes, a comedy group did make number 3 on my favorite songs of the year list with a track that isn't even just purely a comedy song, I'd say, at the end of the day. There's so many aspects to this track that are there to love outside of the comedy even. The inspirational lyrics here that are done really nicely and have a pretty interesting topic to them. The instrumentation here that's excellent. The overall structure and pacing of the track, which is great as well. The infectious hook on this thing. There's so much to love here in this song. So overall, if you're a fan of more comedic music, or just even a rock music fan in general, and you're looking for some great music from this year that falls under those categories, definitely check out this song if you haven't done so already. Next up at number 2 on the list, I have the track Satan in the Wait by Daughters from their newest album, You Won't Get What You Want. Given that Daughters weren't exactly a band that were super experimental, at least when it came to really long song lengths on their previous efforts, it's really surprising that some of the longer tracks from their newest album happen to be some of the best, including this song. That's mostly because on this track, as well as many other tracks from their newest album, the band decides to step back from just beating you over the head with a lot of intense, noisy aggression in favor of creating some longer, more intricate sounding tracks. And Satan in the Wait is no exception to that. This track is a really unnerving listen. Satan in the Wait is easily one of the most paranoid listens I've had in a good long while, and that's in part due to the vocal delivery here on this track, and also due to the instrumentation on this thing as well. The vocals on this thing are very stressed, very paranoid. They kind of sound like the vocalist is losing their mind over the course of this track, and the instrumental to this thing also has a very creepy atmosphere to it. The band, as I said before, decides not to really beat you over the head with some very noisy, aggressive music, and instead decides to go for something a bit more creepy and a bit more atmospheric as well, though some noisy aspects do still pop up in this track. I also really like the use of some more melodic moments, especially on the hook of this track. And the refrain here on this track, "This world is opening up," is just one that's been stuck in my head really since falling in love with this track. It's one that just won't leave my mind, and I just find that a bit odd given that this isn't, your typical pop song or anything like that where you would expect it to get stuck in your head. This is definitely something a lot darker, a lot more sinister, but it's just as sticky. So yeah, if you want something creepy, nightmarish, paranoid, this is the perfect track for you, so listen to it. Even if it's not the perfect track for you, listen to it, because it's a great song. Seriously, listen to it. And with that said, we've made it to the #1 spot on this list. It's time to talk about my favorite song of 2018. Definitely a very difficult choice for me to make, because there were so many great tracks to choose from, especially on this list. Many of the tracks that we've just talked about gave this track a good run for its money, and many of the tracks that appeared on this song's album also gave it a good run for its money, though due to my one song per album rule, none of those other tracks ended up making it onto this list either. The track we're talking about here at #1 is Tonya by Brockhampton, one that may not be super surprising to you guys, at least when it comes to Brockhampton being #1 here on the list, given how much I loved this new album of theirs, Iridescence. And when it came to picking a best song from this album, it was a pretty difficult choice for me to do, because there were so many tracks on the album that I really loved. Honestly, there's other tracks on the album that could have been pretty high up on this list, if not maybe even the #1 spot on this list as well, had I chosen them instead of Tonya. But the reason why I decided to go with this track at the end of the day is because I feel like it really embodies a lot of what I loved in Iridescence just in one track. This track talks about themes about dealing with fame and growing more popular that Iridescence covered at large, but it condenses it down to just one track, which is something I quite like. I like hearing about Kevin Abstract talk about how he'd prefer to just have a normal life in Texas here on this track as opposed to the fame that he's recently got, which is something that when I initially heard on this track was pretty surprising to me, especially when you consider Brockhampton's come up in the past year or so, and how they were pretty much started from the bottom in a sense with not much to them, and quickly grew to be one of the biggest and most talked about groups in hip-hop. And all throughout this, they've talked about getting bigger and wanting to get more popular, and now that they've had the fame in a sense, it's not exactly what they expected in some regard, or at least in some sense, it is what they expected, but there's a lot of unwanted baggage that comes along with that as well, and that's really what they talk about here on this track at large. I just love how genuine and real the lyrics on this track feel at the end of the day, especially as someone who's been a fan of these guys since the first Saturation project dropped, getting to see their come up and all. It's pretty interesting seeing these guys reflect on what's happened to them so far, but I really like how genuine these guys have been throughout that entire ride. And it's definitely very interesting to see them in the position that they are here on this song and in this album in general, but it's still one that I really loved seeing. As for the performances themselves on this track, they're pretty excellent as well. Kevin, Dom, and Merlin are able to deliver some great verses on this thing, all covering the general themes I mentioned earlier, but putting their own personal spins on them as well, which is also something I quite like about Brockhampton in general. I also like how they're able to stay true to themselves and be themselves essentially on these tracks and through their lyrics, while still being able to deliver a very consistent emotional feel here in the song. Joba's sung part towards the middle of this track is also one that I really like for much of the same reasons that I like the rappers here on the track. Just kind of trade out the great rapping for some great singing instead, but keep a lot of the other aspects such as the ability to remain in line with a lot of the themes and the overall feel of the track while still maintaining his own personal feel. And the same could be said for Bareface's opening part of the track as well, which I also really love. And I also really love how this track has a more unconventional structure to it at the end of the day. The song begins with this sung part before transitioning into the rapped segment of the track, and it's overall just a really interesting dynamic between the two. While the structure of this track isn't something that I would classify as super experimental or crazy or anything like that, it is different enough that it's a nice change of pace, and it's executed excellently. The production here is also pretty great. It's kind of like Over Again that we were talking about before in the regard that it's a bit more stripped back and simplistic. However, this is still done so to allow the performers on this track to stand out a bit more and to have their message be a bit more obvious on your initial listens. However, when you do pay the production here a bit more mind on repeated listens, there's still a lot to really take in here. I just love how simple, to the point, yet beautiful, and in line it is with the rest of the emotional feel of the track the production here is. Overall, Tonya, I really love how this track just perfectly embodies a lot about what I love in Iridescence. If I wanted to showcase to someone why I love Iridescence as an album, and I only had one song to do it for some reason, this is probably the one I would pick. I feel like that would get across most of the points. Not all of them, of course, but most of them. So to wrap things up, this track has great rapping, great lyrics, great singing, great production, a pretty interesting structure to it as well. There's not a weak moment on this track at the end of the day, and it's a fantastic listen overall. If you haven't heard this track for whatever reason yet, please do so. I mean, it's at my #1 position on this list for a reason, so definitely check this one out. My #1 song of the year, Tonya by Brockhampton. And with all that said, that concludes this list, my top 10 favorite songs of 2018. Once again, this list is just entirely my own personal opinion, so if you happen to disagree, either in the regard that you think there's other songs out there that are better, or you didn't like the songs I picked or something like that, that's perfectly fine, and as I said before, please leave your own list in the comment section down below. Also, make sure you check out those 2 Spotify playlists I linked in the description down below if you want to hear these tracks as well as a lot of the other tracks that I happen to love from this year. There's also a YouTube playlist linked in the description down below containing all my year-end list videos, as well as just all the list videos I've done in general on this channel. So make sure you check that out if you want to see, my worst songs of the year, worst albums of the year, best EPs of the year, best albums should be coming out soon. If you want to see all that stuff, make sure you check out that playlist. And while you're down there, make sure you also leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content. As I said before, the rest of the year-end list should be coming out shortly, and if you don't want to miss out on that, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Thank you for watching once again, and stay golden.